Situation: Spain is dominated by warlords and mercenaries. Mission: seize the city of Valencia, establish a central base of operations, and dominate the Spanish coast. Execution: lead a force of well-trained knights in close combat, focusing on major population centers. Administration: by his own authority. Command and control: Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, El Cid. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. He was one of the most storied figures of old Europe, both in myth and in legend. His real name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, but history knows him better as El Cid. He was a warrior without peer who used his sword to carve out both a legend and a kingdom. Now, the poets talk of El Cid as the first Christian knight of the Reconquista, the war to take Spain back from the Moors. But historians tell a different tale. They talk of a man who's willing to fight for any boss, whether he was Christian or Muslim. So was he a loyal Christian knight, or was he just a skilled mercenary? Whatever, he was the man people feared and admired. He was El Cid. In 1093, El Cid and his private army of about 4,000 soldiers observed Christmas camped before the walls of Valencia on the east coast of Spain. The Cid was staking his claim for independence from the vassalage he'd been born into. He'd set up camp in July, and no end to the siege was in sight. Storm the walls or starve the people out. That was the standard operating procedure for those who would be conquerors in 11th century Spain. His force was too small to storm the walls, but they were mobile and efficient. They cut off supply lines to the city and ravaged the countryside. Inside the walls, citizens trembled at the rumors of atrocities. The Cid was playing a dangerous waiting game. With time and luck, he would soon be master of Valencia.
So he is a man of his age, a freelance warrior, a man who could get along with the Muslims, who could also fight them, a man who was loyal to his lord, but who could also go on his own and do things which essentially the king will not appreciate.
The Cid represents some very powerful values that happen to coincide in a lot of ways with some American values, I think. These sort of values forged on the frontier. And I think that's one reason why Americans find the Cid such an attractive figure. He's done it for himself through his wits, through his perseverance, through his personal charisma, through his skill in battle.
The siege of the ancient Spanish city is a pivotal moment in El Cid's storied career as a warrior and conqueror. Centuries later, he'd be celebrated as Spain's greatest hero, largely because of an epic poem titled Cantar del Mio Cid, or The Lay of El Cid. The poem, stretching 3,700 lines, is universally considered as the oldest pillar of Spanish literature. But it's also a questionable source for historians because of its very nature. As an epic poem, The Lay of El Cid is essentially fiction, often contradicted by known historical facts. How then to determine the true facts of El Cid's life? For this, we must travel back to the time and place of his birth. You'd be hard-pressed to find a piece of real estate that's been fought over and conquered as much as this. Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Visigoths, Muslims, and Christians all fought to control the hinterlands of Spain at one point or another. When El Cid rode beneath this Roman aqueduct, it was already 1,000 years old. In the 8th century, Muslim Arabs and Berber converts from Africa flooded into Spain. The Spanish called the invaders Moors, since they came from Morocco. They drove the Christian nobility of Spain to the north, into the mountains, but allowed other Christian and Jewish residents to stay in the south. Spain enjoyed a cultural boom under Moorish rule. The Muslim caliphs built grand palaces and mosques. They also introduced advanced agriculture and science. Centered in the city of Cordova, the Muslim dynasty ruled southern Spain for over 3 centuries. But just 10 years before El Cid's birth, the dynasty shattered. Moorish warlords divided the region into numerous separate districts called Taifa states. The Christian nobility in the north immediately took advantage of the fractured Moorish states.
They become easy prey for the Christian kings, and there is a great deal of money to be made. There are large tributes that are paid.
Into this complicated world came El Cid. He was born around the year 1040 to a Christian family living amidst the culture and customs of Islam.
He grew up with people who spoke Arabic, who were either Islamic themselves or who understood the Arabic language.
You have to realize that Christians and Jews in the 8th and 9th and 10th century articulated their own culture in Arabic. It was the dominant language.
El Cid grew up under the rule of a Christian king, Fernando I of Leon and Castile. Fernando ran what looked like a classic protection racket. He extracted tribute payments from Moorish Taifa states across southern Spain and sent raiding parties against those who didn't pay up.
Unlike other parts of Europe, the kings do not have very large estates that generate a great deal of income. The way in which they get income is by participating in these raids. Medieval Spain has been described as a society organized for war. That is to say, all of the Western Middle Ages is a society in which there is a great deal of emphasis on warfare. It is a society which is essentially dominated by those who have a monopoly of weapons.
To maintain control, a king had to depend on the services of knights and mercenaries. At around the age of 14, El Cid was brought to the royal court to serve King Fernando's eldest son, Sancho. The young Cid's education was tailored to his station, vassal and future warrior.
It is a society in which there is this extraordinary ethos of combat. So El Cid belongs very much into this society. He's a member of the middling nobility, should we say, of the people who are not the great magnates.
The majority of El Cid's youth was spent in military training, in particular, learning the art of sword fighting. They say that El Cid's father gave him the sword of a great Visigoth warrior, El Mudara. Arms and armor were prizes that were passed down from generation to generation. A sword like this became El Cid's weapon of choice. While it's not as heavy as the formal feudal broadsword, it's still a lethal piece of steel that can be used to slash through the chainmail armor of the period. You see, Spanish warriors of the 11th century weren't so concerned about weapons that could thrust. What they needed was a weapon that could be used to slash from horseback. And armor of the period was exceptionally light. It had to be, so it could be worn on long-range raids. But military success in the Middle Ages required more than cold steel. El Cid learned to use other important tools of conquest. El Cid undoubtedly became expert in the use of instruments like this. It's an astrolabe, an ancient instrument of Greek origin which is used both for navigation and for time reckoning. The Muslims introduced its use into Spain, and it remained one of the most important instruments for astronomers until the end of the 18th century. El Cid's ability to use instruments like this for navigation, particularly in Spain, the second most mountainous country in Europe, would stand him in good stead for the rest of his life. For his skill, El Cid was named man-at-arms to Prince Sancho in King Fernando's army. Together, they rode to battle in 1063 when Cid was about 23 years old. This was his first battle. It was a bloody fight between King Fernando and his own brother, the King of Aragon. In medieval Spain, blood was not thicker than water or money. The two royal brothers were fighting over who would control the tributes from a Muslim emir called Al-Muqtadir, a man who would figure prominently in El Cid's future. At this battle,
El Cid fought gallantly to protect the emir's land, distinguishing himself as a brave and fearless warrior. By the end of the battle, Fernando's army prevailed, and his brother, the King of Aragon, was killed. Two years later, King Fernando died. He divided his lands and protectorates among his three sons, including Sancho. For El Cid, now standard-bearer and drill sergeant for King Sancho, the opportunities were limitless. But another generation of war between brothers was also on the horizon. By his early 20s, El Cid was man-at-arms to King Sancho II of Castile. It was the highest position for a warrior at court. El Cid's cavalry was composed of minor nobles like himself. They brought their own war horses and armor, and El Cid trained them for combat, including how to fight on horseback.
A major innovation in mounted warfare occurred in the 11th century with the development of what was known as the couched lance. Now, prior to this time, a warrior on horseback could use a spear in one of two ways, either overhand for throwing or underhand for thrusting. With the couched lance, you had a longer, heavier shaft that could be supported under your arm with your hand well back, thus giving you more extension of the lethal end. Now, using a couched lance from a galloping war horse took a lot of training, both for the man and for the horse, but the advantages were obvious. You had a lethal weapon that was composed of the strengths of the lance, the man, and the horse. Just imagine hundreds of mounted warriors charging across the field with couched lances. It was the most lethal weapon ever seen on a medieval battlefield.
The cavalry accompanied El Cid to collect tributes from the Taifa rulers. In return, they were given a share of the spoils from raiding parties. Soon, El Cid had more to fight for. Fernando had willed Castile to his oldest son, Sancho, but the best part of his land, León, was given to his second son, Alfonso VI.
Once Fernando distributes his realm, makes the big mistake of giving part of his realm to Alfonso and another part to Sancho, that once again divides the kingdom between the Leonese and the Castilians.
Fraternal strife and envy turned to open war in 1068. Over the next 4 years, Sancho and Alfonso met repeatedly on the battlefield. The decisive year was 1072. In January, Sancho captured León and sent his brother into exile. Alfonso found refuge in the Moorish city of Toledo, just across the Spanish frontier from a small town called Zamora. Though small, Zamora held a key strategic position on the road to León. Just 9 months later, rumors started to fly of an insurrection in Zamora. Fearing the worst, Sancho and El Cid rushed to the scene. In the 11th century, a king had to rule from his horse, not from his throne.
It's said that El Cid distinguished himself in every battle, but especially at Zamora. Reportedly, he fought 15 knights at once, killed one on horse too, and sent the rest running. But while El Cid was engaged, Sancho was killed. Rumors of treachery spread quickly.
The question is, who was responsible for this? When he was killed at Zamora, his brother Alfonso was probably in Toledo, and he had been exiled to Toledo.
It looks to me, as it has seemed to many other people over the last 900 years, that his brother Alfonso was in some way, not directly, but in some way implicated in it. I mean, certainly he profited most from the murder, taking over Sancho's kingdom.
Luckily, El Cid's unrivaled skill in battle assured him a place in Alfonso's court, if he chose to pursue it.
The Cid needed the king as a vassal needs a lord. The king needed the Cid as a lord needs a vassal. I mean, here was a basis for negotiating, compromising, burying the hatchet, getting on with life. They had to do that if they were to survive, and I think in the real world this is what they did.
In the epic poem, this practical reconciliation is given mythical significance.
He presses the king to swear that he had nothing to do with the death of his brother, with the betrayal of his brother. And Alfonso VI does do that and swears and takes the oath.
While the poetic story of the oath is mythical, there is plenty of evidence that El Cid and King Alfonso did come to terms.
The Cid made this very grand and imposing marriage in the middle 1070s. And the likelihood is that this was a match that was actually arranged by the king, and it was partly a reward for the services that El Cid had already done him.
One of the witnesses to the marriage was Garcia Ordóñez, Alfonso's favorite warrior and courtier. He would soon become the Cid's nemesis.
The court of an 11th century king in Spain was quite a tricksy sort of place, as courts tend to be. This was the sort of place where hatreds and rivalries could very rapidly build up.
The first fallout came in 1079 with the collection of the tributes. El Cid was sent to Seville, Garcia to Granada. One source claims Garcia made the first move. Another suggests that El Cid was the aggressor. All agree they met in battle at Cabra. It was a bloody engagement, with El Cid wielding his mighty sword, decimating all in his way. When the dust settled, El Cid was victorious. Not only that, he captured Garcia and held him prisoner for 3 days.
Garcia clearly thought that he had been publicly humiliated by El Cid, and this was the sort of thing that no self-respecting nobleman of that date was going to stand for.
El Cid released Garcia, but Garcia did not forget the humiliation. In the cutthroat circle of the royal court, Garcia was the first to have the king's ear. Rumors started around that El Cid was skimming off the king's tributes.
Garcia Ordóñez is just a sort of sore loser and an invidious person who does not like the fact that here's this upstart. He calls him the son of a miller, which is perhaps the worst insult you can call someone in the Middle Ages, because millers were believed to be cheats and thieves who took a little bit of everybody's flour.
We have independent evidence from actually a Muslim source that Count Garcia was known as Crooked Mouth. And although it's possible that this nickname owed its origin to some sort of physical trait, such as a hare lip or something like that, it could also indicate that his shortcomings were moral rather than physical, that he was a man who was liable to tell tales, to stir up trouble.
In 1081, El Cid led a massive raid on the settlements near Toledo, another protectorate of King Alfonso. His pretext was revenge against bandits operating in the area. El Cid and his knights devastated the countryside and took 7,000 prisoners. It was an overt display of power. For King Alfonso, suspicion turned to paranoia, fueled by Garcia's insidious whisper campaign against El Cid. Alfonso feared that El Cid was making a move to usurp his position. The king sent the Cid into exile and confiscated all his property. For El Cid, a lifetime of service was wiped out and a bleak future awaited. Banished from his home, stripped of all he owned, El Cid began a journey to rebuild his reputation.
It was a blow, yes, but maybe not quite such a heavy blow as one might think. The experience of exile was really fairly common for noblemen of this period. There was an expectation that exile wouldn't necessarily last all that long and that you would get your lands back.
El Cid took stock of the neighboring warlords. Competition was fierce, and El Cid knew his skills were in demand. He also knew there were rich rewards to be had.
The Cid was a soldier through and through, and a very good one. So that this was the only means he had of, if you like, earning a living. He had to find someone who would pay him to fight for them. He had to become, in short, a mercenary soldier. And this is what he did during his exile.
In Zaragoza, he found himself before the Emir al-Muqtadir, the same ruler he'd fought for in 1063. Since that time, al-Muqtadir had added much of Spain's Mediterranean coast to his kingdom. A successful diplomat, he was also known to be a poet, philosopher, and master of astrology and geometry.
The Cid went to the court of the Muslim Emir of Zaragoza and said, "Hire me." Which he did, and I think didn't regret it, because the Cid served him extremely well, and no doubt made plenty of money in the course of this.
Al-Muqtadir had watched the Cid go from a fledgling knight to a man powerful enough to make King Alfonso VI feel threatened. He hired him in a heartbeat. Some say it was Al-Muqtadir who gave him the nickname the Cid.
The name itself is an Arabic term, is someone who, in a sense, not only has Muslim friendships and great deal of respect from Muslims and respects them at the same time, but who also was probably, as was anyone in this period who was in relationship with the Muslims, deeply imprinted by Muslim culture.
But al-Muqtadir died within a year of hiring El Cid. He divided his kingdom among competing male heirs. One of his sons was given lands to the east and south. Another son was given the city of Zaragoza. El Cid stayed in Zaragoza to serve this new emir.
We don't know what sort of footing the Cid would have been on at the emir's court, whether they were on sort of equal terms of sort of dining together or joking together, or whether the Cid was seen as a sort of subordinate, just a kind of military technician. No, we simply don't know.
The rivalry between the two Moorish brothers grew heated. For El Cid, this was a virtual replay of the Spanish Wars between Sancho and Alfonso. El Cid had learned from his earlier experiences. In Zaragoza, he concentrated on training his troops into an efficient fighting force while strengthening his outlying defenses. One of the sites he chose to refortify was an old castle at Almanar. From centuries of warfare, the Spanish landscape was riddled with ruins. By some estimates, there was some type of fortification roughly every 11 square miles. In a land scoured by bandits, state-sanctioned or maverick, it was important to have a refuge within easy reach. They also guaranteed security for communication and supply lines. The Battle of the Moorish Brothers began in the summer of 1082. Under siege at Almanar, El Cid faced a hastily formed army of mercenaries. Though El Cid was greatly outnumbered, the Random Alliance was no match for the discipline of El Cid's highly trained soldiers. His men captured an enemy baggage train and took hostages, including the Count of Barcelona and a number of his knights and horses.
I think we can reasonably assume that the Cid was a good and successful commander, largely because of what he did before a campaign was entered upon. I think we can fairly assume, on the track record of his victories, that his men must have been very well trained. I think one can fairly assume that the Cid was well aware of that old military maxim, time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted, and that his campaigns were, so far as campaigns can be, meticulously planned with reference to natural features of the landscape and so forth.
Significantly, the Cid's service for his Muslim emir in Zaragoza is omitted from the epic Christian poem of his life.
This episode has been entirely edited out. In the poem, the Cid is never presented as fighting in the service of Muslims, but only as fighting against them.
While El Cid remained in exile fighting for the Moors, Alfonso's troubles were worsening. The people of Toledo, his protectorate, were casting about for new leadership. Alfonso had long depended on tribute payments from Toledo. Fearing insurrection, he laid siege to the city in the fall of 1084. The winter was brutal, and Toledo's defenses were strong, but Alfonso's army waited them out. The siege lasted 10 months. In the wake of famine and disease, the city finally surrendered in May 1085. It was the first major conquest by a Christian army in southern Spain for over 300 years. Alarms went up through the region. Moorish leaders feared that this was the first of many invasions to come.
For everybody else, it was a waking call, because it meant that the Castilians had other ideas besides just simply collecting tribute from them.
To stave off a Christian reconquest of southern Spain, the Muslims looked across the straits to Africa. There, a new power was rising, a strict and militaristic sect of Islam called the Almoravids.
You are caught between a rock and a hard place. In the north, you have these Christians, who sometimes could be your friends, sometimes can raid your lands. So here is the rock in the north, almost ready to get and fall on top of you. And then in North Africa are the Almoravids. And these are a far more observant group of Muslims with a very different vision of what Islam ought to be, far more austere and far more demanding of the subjects. That is the hard place.
The Muslims who lived in Spain had made a world of great beauty, luxury, and leisure. They were devoted Muslims, but had a taste for wine and astrology. The Taifa rulers knew they would lose their cities, but they still had time to choose their own conquerors.
With whom do you have more in common? With someone like El Cid, someone like Alfonso VI, who have lived among yourselves, or with Yusuf, the ruler of the Almoravids?
One Moorish ruler is said to have cast a decisive vote, famously saying, "I would rather be a camel driver in Morocco than a swineherd in Castile." With that, a new wave of invaders was on the way. The Cid spent 5 years in the service of the Moorish emirs of Zaragoza. With every victory, he restored his reputation, enriched his coffers, and strengthened his army's loyalty. But his former boss, King Alfonso VI of Castile, was also on a roll, gaining victories and amassing a fortune. In an attempt to further expand his influence and seize more tributes, Alfonso decided to lead his army against Zaragoza, and he would lead it in person. There, he could have met his former subject and trusted knight El Cid, but fate intervened. Before Alfonso could close in on Zaragoza, the Moorish kings played their wild card. They appealed to fellow Muslims in Morocco, a new sect known as the Almoravids.
They're best thought of as a kind of fundamentalist sect within Islam who were dedicated to upholding Islamic law and traditions in their starkest form.
When the Almoravids looked to Spain, they had reservations.
They were very displeased at what they saw. Muslim rulers who were being forced to pay tribute to Christian rulers, who were being forced, in order to raise the money for the tribute, to impose taxes not sanctioned by the authority of the Quran.
The invasion force from Morocco was led by a warrior named Yusuf. He crossed the Straits of Gibraltar with an army of 7,000 horsemen and infantry.
They're coming over to defend territory that they had won hundreds of years previously.
Yusuf's army included warriors from as far as sub-Saharan Africa, armed with bamboo spears, leather shields, and war drums. They headed north through Spain, recruiting mercenaries and grabbing slaves on the way. By the time they reached Sagrajas, the force totaled about 20,000 men. The battle was joined at Sagrajas. There, Alfonso, with his army of approximately 40,000 soldiers and allies, unleashed a surprise cavalry attack during the Muslim Friday evening prayers. But the surprise attack was repulsed, and the Christian cavalry were quickly overtaken and slaughtered. Many of Alfonso's allies also deserted him, some in fear of the ominous drumming and strange weapons used by the African warriors with Yusuf. Corpses were scattered along the road. It was a complete rout, but King Alfonso escaped.
The Battle of Sagrajas in 1086 was a shattering defeat for Alfonso. He'd been a very successful king for 20 years.
But the Almoravids had not come to occupy Spain. Once they defeated Alfonso's army, they returned to Morocco. Alfonso took advantage of the reprieve. He made an overture to El Cid, ending his exile and asking him to return to his court.
So it's in the wake of that battle that we find Alfonso restoring El Cid to favor with him and negotiating a deal with him. Because he needed people, the people he invited could call the tune. It was, as you might say, a vassal's market.
El Cid had honed his army to a seemingly invincible fighting machine. He agreed to defend Alfonso's territories against any threats. In return, the Cid would retain full ownership for himself and his descendants over any territories he seized from the Moors. El Cid would establish his own dynasty.
He is, in some respects, a freelance, someone who allies with Muslims against Christians, who allies with Christians against other Christians, who is trying to build himself a kingdom, a state, a possession.
Summoned by the Moorish leader in Spain, the Almoravids returned 3 years later.
To cut a long story short, over the next few years, Yusuf and his Almoravids took over the Islamic principalities of Spain, thus reuniting Islamic Spain under a single authority, which of course was much more menacing to the Christian authorities like Alfonso VI in the north. And so from being on the aggressive in the 1070s and early 1080s, Alfonso VI was suddenly put on the defensive.
Knowing he was in trouble, Alfonso called on El Cid in 1089 to help him fight the invading Almoravids. It was the most important test of their reconciliation. It didn't last long. El Cid missed an important battlefield rendezvous, and Alfonso suffered another massive defeat. He blamed El Cid and sent him into exile once again. This time, El Cid didn't seek a patron. He drove his band of armored horsemen north along the Mediterranean coast, demanding tributes for his own war chest. Muslim and Christian, the rulers of the region's major cities joined forces to confront the newcomer.
Acting on a tip from his old friend, the Emir of Zaragoza, El Cid was able to retreat to the mountains near Tovar, north of Valencia. There, he set up a position well fortified high up on the mountain. The pursuit was led by the Count of Barcelona, and he set up camp on a flat lower down. Under cover of darkness, he sent an element of his soldiers way up high on the mountain, and very soon, El Cid's position was surrounded. At dawn, the forces converged. Now, the Count of Barcelona had surprise on his side, and initially things went his way. El Cid was wounded and on horse, but once again, his luck held. In a virtual replay of the Battle of Almanar, El Cid rallied his forces to victory. The Count of Barcelona was captured along with his best men. Their hasty attack cost them dearly, both in lives and in ransom.
It's perfectly clear that the Cid was a very skillful commander. I think it's also clear that he was a very lucky commander. I suspect also that this was something to do with morale.
Over the next few years, El Cid intensified his stronghold on the coast, establishing a power base near the city of Valencia where he collected tributes. His biggest challenge to dominating the city came from King Alfonso. Enlisting the aid of an Italian fleet, Alfonso blockaded Valencia. But the Cid countered with an attack where it hurt Alfonso most, on Castile. El Cid personally led a brutal raid on the rich farm region.
He went into Garcia's lands in the Rioja and apparently laid them waste very violently and ruthlessly as a way of getting back at his enemy.
The Cid was successful. Alfonso took the warning to leave Valencia. For El Cid, a new threat was gathering in the south. The Almoravids had set their sights on El Cid's land, on Valencia. Here's El Cid's tips for conquerors. Cavalry is the arm of decision on the battlefield. Pay close attention to logistics and land navigation. Patience is a battlefield virtue, especially in siege operations. In 1092, the Almoravids thundered toward Valencia. They were summoned by a Moorish judge who was leading a coup in the city. El Cid, after driving King Alfonso away from Valencia, was determined to keep the city and its rich tributes for himself. He envisioned it as his own kingdom.
Now, Valencia, of course, is a very special place. And it is an incredible prize to win because Valencia is surrounded by an extraordinary fertile garden, the Huerta of Valencia, by an agricultural area that produces an incredible amount of agricultural goods and which had a tremendous system of irrigation.
El Cid led raids against the settlements outside Valencia's walls, but allowed those residents who surrendered to retain their homes and fields. Because an army fights on its stomach, El Cid knew he would need the farms to feed his troops during a long siege. By July, he had the city completely blockaded.
Today, the gates of the walled city of Valencia are located in the middle of town, with the ocean miles away. In El Cid's day, the ocean was only 10 blocks over in that direction.
For El Cid, Valencia was indeed a very rich prize. And it would have been the making. You could even speculate, although this is, of course, sheer speculation, that it could have been the making of a kind of independent holding for El Cid.
Before the Almoravid army could arrive, the judge surrendered to El Cid in May 1094. After 10 months, the siege of Valencia was over. But soon, El Cid would become the besieged. He barely had time to imprison the rebellious Moorish judge before the Almoravids arrived on the scene. El Cid immediately sought reinforcements from his allies, but none came. He would face the invaders alone. The Almoravids set up camp on the plain of Cuarte, where they outnumbered El Cid's army. For 10 days and nights, they used psychological warfare against El Cid. Circling the walls of Valencia, they filled the air with shrieks and the deafening beats of war drum. A second siege was on. The Almoravids opened the siege by attacking El Cid's supply lines. Time was at a premium, so El Cid attacked immediately. Cleverly, he devised a cavalry feint, sending one band of horsemen out one of Valencia's 5 city gates. When the Almoravids attacked Cid's horsemen, he sent another unit out another gate to attack the Muslim rear. It was a total surprise and a brilliant maneuver. In the space of a day, El Cid had routed the enemy. The dead lay all about the city as he returned triumphant with loot and captives. News of the victory spread like wildfire. It was the first time that the Almoravids had been defeated.
This defeat of the Almoravids had tremendous resonance. I mean, not just with Spain. It really excited Western Christendom that these terrifying, unknown people from Africa, could be defeated.
But now it was time for El Cid to secure his rule in Valencia. In a gruesome act of retribution, he executed the rebel Moorish judge by burning him alive. He then imprisoned the city's aristocracy and ransomed them for outrageous sums. He continued to raid surrounding settlements.
Of course, he has been described as a hard master. In a sense, in the Middle Ages and in Valencia, in the Valencia of El Cid, it is a matter about ruling with an iron hand. But at the same time, as every successful ruler does, to have the ability to provide largesse and gift to those who are loyal to you. It is about punishing the wicked and rewarding the good, which essentially here means punishing your enemies and rewarding your friends, whoever they are.
The Cid's ability to defeat these hitherto undefeated Almoravid armies is really most remarkable. And I think one has to say it, it's inexplicable. But he had the reputation of being invincible. And I think if you're up against someone who is widely believed to be invincible, this is quite scary.
Next up for conquest was the Rock of Murviedro on the city's northern approach. El Cid was following in great footsteps. 1,400 years earlier, Hannibal had fought for this same position. As long as it was in Islamic hands, the Cid's claim on Valencia was in trouble.
It is quite simply the strongest natural defensive position on the whole of that central sector of the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Messages, merchants, the movement of commodities, military supplies, it could all be threatened if there was a hostile presence on the Rock of Murviedro.
At Murviedro, El Cid employed some psyops of his own. He threatened to burn alive or otherwise torture and execute everyone inside the city if they did not surrender. When they did surrender, he instead marched them all in chains to Valencia. He was now the city's undisputed master. The Cid ruled in Valencia for 5 years, but his hopes to establish a dynasty were dashed. His son Diego was killed in battle. The details are lost, but one tantalizing fact has surfaced. Diego died fighting for King Alfonso VI against the Almoravids. When El Cid died, he had no successor. Valencia fell to the Almoravids soon after.
Yusuf comes knocking again, and they are not able to hold Valencia without the Cid's leadership. Maybe that was one of his mistakes as a leader. He didn't have someone to take over for him and to defend Valencia beyond his death.
Some see the death of El Cid as the end of an era in the history of Spain.
He was not unusual, he's typical. Someone like El Cid could grow up in the service of a Christian king, be exiled by him, transfer into the service of a Muslim king, come back to serve the Christian king later on, and eventually end up as his own man, ruler of his own independent principality.
El Cid's rule in Valencia may have been short, but his successes have proved immortal.
All indications are that El Cid died peacefully in the year 1099. On hearing the news, one French chronicler wrote, "In Spain, at Valencia, Count El Cid died. This was a great grief to the Christians and a great joy to his pagan enemies. But even his enemies gave El Cid grudging respect. One Moorish writer wrote, 'This man, the scourge of his time, by his appetite for glory, by the steadfastness of his character, and by his heroic bravery, was one of the miracles of God.' One thing's for certain, El Cid was never defeated on this earth by any man." I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching Conquerors.